I never imagined that a single construction crane could end up costing somebody hundreds of thousands of dollars. Honestly, if you told me that a year ago, I probably would have laughed and said there had to be more to the story. Turns out there was. And somehow, I ended up right in the middle of it. I live in a small town outside Cedar Ridge, the kind of place where people still wave from their pickup trucks, and everybody somehow knows who bought what house before the moving truck even leaves the driveway. Nothing exciting ever really happened there, which was exactly why I liked it. My house sits at the very end of a dead-end street. It's not fancy. The roof is older than I'd like to admit, the porch creaks when it rains, and every spring I swear I'm finally going to repaint the garage but never actually get around to it. Still, it was mine. Every board, every nail, every annoying repair project. One of my favorite things about the property was the driveway. Most people probably wouldn't think twice about a driveway, but mine stretched almost 80 feet from the road back to the detached garage. It wasn't paved, just gravel, uneven in spots, but gave me space, privacy, a little buffer between me and the rest of the world. When I bought the place nearly 12 years earlier, I had paid extra for a full property survey. At the time, it seemed like one of those boring adult decisions nobody enjoys spending money on, but the survey clearly showed every boundary line on the lot. No shared access, no easements, no gray areas. At least that's what I remembered. For years, it never mattered. Then the empty lot next door got sold. At first, I thought it was good news. The property had been sitting vacant forever, collecting weeds and abandoned lawn furniture that somehow appeared there every summer. When I heard a development company had bought it, I figured somebody was finally going to build something useful. The construction started about a month later. Every morning before sunrise, I'd hear diesel engines rumbling down the street, trucks backing up, generators firing up, nail guns popping in the distance. It was louder than I was used to, but honestly, I didn't complain. Progress is progress. One of the workers, a younger guy named Mateo, would usually give me a nod whenever he saw me outside drinking coffee on the porch. "Morning, sir." "Morning." That was about the extent of our relationship. They worked. I lived next door. Everything seemed fine. Then one Tuesday morning, I walked outside and immediately felt like something was off. The site was strangely quiet. Not silent exactly, but quieter. The usual noise was gone. Instead, there was this low mechanical hum coming from somewhere near the road. I grabbed my coffee, walked toward the garage, climbed into my truck, backed out like I always did, and then slammed on the brakes so hard my coffee flew into the passenger seat. A massive yellow crane was sitting directly across the entrance to my driveway. Not beside it, not near it, across it. The thing looked like it had been dropped from the sky overnight. Its outriggers were fully extended, metal feet planted deep into the gravel. Two of those stabilizers sat squarely on my property. For a few seconds, I just stared. My brain honestly couldn't process what I was looking at. Surely somebody would come move it. Surely there was some misunderstanding. I waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 20. Nothing changed. The crane kept lifting steel beams over the construction site, while workers moved around below like this was completely normal. Eventually, I shut off my truck and climbed out. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked toward the site. Near the edge stood a guy holding a clipboard. Mid-50s. Hot, reflective vest. The kind of guy who looked like he'd spent 30 years telling people what to do. I figured he was the site supervisor. "Hey," I called out. He glanced up. "That crane's blocking my driveway." He looked toward it for maybe half a second. "Yeah. Just yeah." Like we were discussing the weather. I pointed toward the outriggers. "It's sitting on my property." He shifted the clipboard under one arm. "Only temporary." Temporary. Funny how often that word shows up right before somebody creates a much bigger problem. "How temporary?" I asked. He checked his watch. "Couple hours." Then he shrugged. "The street's too narrow. We need the angle. Easiest place to set up." The easiest place. That phrase stayed with me, because what he really meant was something else. He meant my property was the easiest place. My inconvenience was the easiest solution. My rights were the easiest thing to ignore. I stood there for a second, waiting for an apology that never came. Then I nodded. All right, that surprised him. I think he expected an argument. Instead, I simply turned around and walked back toward my house. The crane remained there the entire day. And when I stepped outside the following morning and saw that same yellow boom stretching across the sky once again, I had a feeling this wasn't going to be a one-time problem. I just didn't realize yet how expensive that assumption was about to become. The second morning started exactly the same way. Same crane, same position, same stabilizers pressed into my gravel like they own the place. I sat in my truck for a moment staring at it, and I remember thinking something that surprised even me. They never asked. That was the part that kept bothering me. Not the inconvenience, not even the delay. The fact that nobody had ever walked over and said, "Hey, would you mind if we used a small portion of your property for a couple of hours?" Maybe I still would have said no. Maybe I would have said yes. But they never gave me the choice. By the time I walked down to the site, the supervisor was standing in almost the exact same spot as the day before. His name, according to the patch on his vest, was Rick. I hadn't noticed that earlier. "We're doing this again?" I asked. Rick gave a small smile. The kind people use when they already know they're wrong, but aren't interested in changing course. "Just temporary." I laughed softly. Temporary usually doesn't happen 2 days in a row. That got a slightly different reaction. Not much. Just enough. He looked over his shoulder toward the crane, then back at me. "We got deadlines," he said. "The crane needs a safe operating angle. There's really no other way to do it." I remember looking past him at the massive construction site. The framing was barely halfway complete. Stacks of steel sat everywhere. Dozens of workers moved around carrying equipment. This wasn't some tiny family project struggling to survive. This was a company with money, a company with lawyers, a company that apparently believed my property line was optional. "That's unfortunate," I said. Rick sighed. "We're not hurting anything." I looked down at the gravel, where one stabilizer had already created a visible depression. Maybe not intentionally. His expression hardened slightly. Not angry, just annoyed, like I was becoming an obstacle. A scheduling issue. A delay. The conversation ended exactly where the first one had, with him dismissing the concern and me walking away. But something had changed. The first day I was irritated. The second day I became curious. And curiosity can be dangerous, especially when somebody assumes you won't look too closely. By the third morning, I stopped talking altogether. Instead, I started watching. Construction crews develop routines. You notice that pretty quickly. The crane arrived around 7:10 every morning. Outriggers down by 7:25. Work began around 7:30. The driveway remained blocked until sometime afternoon. Every day, like clockwork, I started taking pictures. Nothing dramatic, just photographs, wide shots, close shots, pictures showing exactly where the stabilizers sat in relation to my driveway. Then I started recording video. I narrated quietly. Date, time, location, no emotion, just facts. If there was one thing my father taught me growing up, it was this: never argue when evidence can do the talking for you. Meanwhile, the construction crew kept treating the situation like normal. Mateo, the younger worker, actually stopped by one afternoon while I was checking my mailbox. He looked uncomfortable, the way somebody looks when they're caught standing between two sides of an argument. "Mr. Walker," he said. I nodded. "Mateo." He shifted his hard hat under one arm. "I just wanted to say, some of us know the crane situation isn't great." I smiled. I figured. He glanced back toward the site. "Rick's under pressure from corporate. They're way behind schedule." That was interesting. I hadn't known that. "How far behind?" He hesitated. "Few weeks already." Then he lowered his voice. "They're trying to make up time." Suddenly everything made more sense. The rush, the shortcuts, the attitude. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to start parking cranes on private property unless something else is pushing them. Deadlines, money, pressure, the old recipe for bad decisions. That evening, I pulled out every document from when I bought my house. The survey took some digging. It was buried inside a folder that hadn't been opened in years. I spread everything across the kitchen table. Closing documents, inspection reports, property maps, tax records. Eventually, I found it. The survey. The boundary lines were crystal clear. There it was. My driveway. Entirely inside my property. No shared access rights. No utility easements. No construction access agreements. Nothing. I traced the line with my finger, then checked it again and again, not because I doubted it, because I wanted to be absolutely certain before taking another step. Around midnight, I sat back in my chair and stared out the kitchen window toward the dark construction site. The floodlights were still running. Machines sat frozen in place. Steel beams cast long shadows across the lot. And for the first time, I stopped thinking about inconvenience. This wasn't about a blocked driveway anymore. It was about entitlement. Someone had decided their project mattered more than my property rights. The next morning, I didn't even bother speaking to Rick. I simply added another entry to my growing collection of photos and videos. Day 4, Day 5, Day 6, everything documented, everything organized. And then I drove downtown. The city permit office occupied an aging brick building near the courthouse square. Inside, it smelled faintly like paper, dust, and old air conditioning. A woman behind the counter greeted me. "Can I help you?" I gave her the construction address. "I'm curious about the permits for the project." She raised an eyebrow. Not suspicious, just interested. Most people don't ask to review construction permits. She disappeared into the back and returned carrying a surprisingly thick file. I thanked her and found a small table near the wall. For almost 30 minutes, I flipped through paperwork. Engineering approvals, zoning documents, structural plans, environmental compliance forms. Nothing unusual. Page after page. Then I found something. Actually, I almost missed it. A section labeled equipment staging and site operations. Small print. Easy to overlook. But the language was remarkably clear. Heavy equipment must remain within approved construction boundaries. No encroachment on a neighboring private property without written authorization. No obstruction of private access routes. Special consideration required for emergency vehicle accessibility. I read it once, then again, then a third time, because suddenly the entire situation looked very different. This wasn't a disagreement between neighbors. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a matter of opinion. They were violating the terms of their permit. Period. I closed the file and walked back to the counter. The woman smiled politely. "Find what you needed?" I smiled back. Actually, yes. The drive home felt strangely peaceful. Not because I was angry. Not because I was planning revenge. Because uncertainty had disappeared. I finally knew exactly where I stood. And more importantly, I knew where they stood. The next morning the crane returned. Right on schedule. Same position. Same outriggers. Same block driveway. I stepped outside and watched for a minute. Workers moved around. Steel swung through the air. Nobody looked remotely concerned. Which made sense. They had no idea what I'd learned the day before. I walked back inside. Made myself a fresh cup of coffee. Sat at the kitchen table. Opened my laptop. Found the city's online complaint portal. Attached photographs. Attached dates. Attached video evidence. Included permit references. Kept everything factual, professional, simple. No emotional language. No threats. No accusations. Just evidence. When I finally hit submit, the confirmation screen appeared almost instantly. Complaint received. I stared at those 2 words for a moment. Then closed the laptop. Outside, the crane continued working. Inside, I went about my day. And honestly, I expected nothing to happen for weeks. Government offices aren't exactly known for moving fast. But around 1 o'clock that afternoon, something unexpected pulled into the street. A white sedan with a city seal on the door. Then another one right behind it. In the moment I saw those vehicles stop beside the construction site, I had a feeling somebody's schedule was about to become a lot more complicated. The 2 city vehicles parked near the construction entrance, and for a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the doors opened. 2 inspectors stepped out carrying tablets, measuring equipment, and the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing the rules better than everyone else in the room. I watched from my living room window, not hiding, not spying, just observing. At that point, the situation no longer belonged to me. I'd already done my part. The inspectors walked straight toward the crane. No small talk, no introductions, no dramatic confrontation, just business. One of them rolled a measuring wheel along the edge of the property line. The other took photographs. Careful photographs. Methodical photographs, the kind that end up inside official reports. I remember feeling strangely detached as I watched. Maybe because I'd spent nearly a week being treated like I was overreacting. Maybe because after enough people dismiss your concerns, you start questioning yourself. Had I been too sensitive, too stubborn, too territorial? Then I watched the measuring wheel pass directly beneath the crane's stabilizer foot. And suddenly, all that doubt disappeared. The inspector stopped, looked down, looked at his tablet, then exchanged a glance with his partner. Not a dramatic glance, not some movie moment, just the look professionals give each other when evidence confirms what they already suspected. A few minutes later, they approached Rick. Even from my porch, I could tell the conversation wasn't going the way he wanted. Rick immediately started talking. His hands moved constantly, pointing toward the street, pointing toward the crane, pointing toward the building, explaining, justifying, defending. I couldn't hear the words, but I already knew the argument. The road is too narrow. The schedule is tight. There was nowhere else to put it. Temporary inconvenience. Necessary operation. I'd heard it all before. One inspector listened patiently, then said something short, something direct. Whatever it was landed like a hammer, because I watched Rick's shoulders drop almost instantly. Not dramatically, just enough. The kind of body language people show when they realize the conversation is over. 10 minutes later, the crane shut down. The engine noise faded. The operator lowered the hook. The boom retracted. And for the first time in nearly a week, those massive stabilizers began lifting out of my driveway. Slowly, almost reluctantly, metal rose from the gravel. The crane folded itself back together and rolled away from my property. I won't lie, that felt good. Not because somebody was getting punished, because something wrong was finally being corrected. There's a difference. That evening, I noticed a bright orange notice attached to the construction fence. Even from a distance, I recognized what it was. A stop work order, large lettering, official stamps, no room for interpretation. Temporary suspension pending correction of permit violations. I walked closer just to confirm what I was reading, then stood there quietly for a minute. The site was silent. No generators, no machinery, no workers, just wind moving through unfinished framing. And that's when the reality finally hit me. I never asked for the project to be shut down. I never demanded penalties. I never threatened anyone. All I wanted was access to my own driveway. That was it. The following morning, there was a knock on my front door. I already knew who it was. Rick stood on the porch. No clipboard this time. No supervisor pasture. No confidence. Just a tired-looking man dealing with consequences. Morning, he said. Morning. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed. Look, I think this whole thing got bigger than it needed to. I leaned against the doorway. Did it? His jaw tightened slightly. We were trying to keep the project moving. I know. The delays are costing us a lot of money. I nodded. I imagine they are. There was another pause. Then he tried a different approach. What if we worked something out? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because now, after days of ignoring me, suddenly he wanted cooperation. Worked what out? I asked. Maybe limited access during certain hours. Maybe temporary permission. I shook my head. Calmly. No. His expression changed. Not anger. More disbelief. Like he genuinely expected negotiation. You've got to understand the position we're in. I looked past him toward the construction site. Then back at him. Rick, I told you on day one it was my property. He didn't answer. I told you again on day two. Still nothing. You made a decision. Now you're dealing with the result. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I delivered the simplest sentence I'd said throughout the entire situation. Keep your equipment on your property. That's the deal. Nothing more. Nothing less. He stared at me for a second, then slowly nodded. Fair enough. And just like that, the conversation ended. 3 days later, the stop work order was lifted. The project resumed. The crane returned. But this time, everything looked different. The machine remained entirely inside the construction boundary. No outriggers on my driveway. No blocked access. No circuits. The operators had less room to work with. Every lift took longer. Every maneuver required more planning. Every task became more complicated. In other words, they finally had to build the project the way they were supposed to from the beginning. Over the following weeks, I occasionally saw workers adjusting equipment, repositioning materials, and reworking schedules. Nobody complained to me. Nobody knocked on my door again. The message had been received. Months later, I heard through town gossip that the project finished nearly 2 months behind schedule. Maybe more. By then, additional subcontractors had to be rescheduled. Deliveries got pushed back. Labor costs increased. Penalties started piling up. The exact number was probably known only by accountants and attorneys. But everyone agreed on one thing. The delays were expensive. Very expensive. One morning, after the building was finally completed, I drove past the site on my way into town. Something caught my eye. A new sign had been installed near the entrance. Simple. White background. Black lettering. Construction vehicles must remain within property boundaries. I actually laughed out loud, sitting alone in my truck. Not a smug laugh. Not a victory laugh. Just the kind of laugh that comes when life decides to make a point more clearly than you ever could. Because in the end, this story wasn't really about a crane. It wasn't about permits. It wasn't about construction. It was about boundaries. The invisible lines people assume don't matter until crossing them becomes expensive. And if I'm being completely honest, there are moments when I still wonder whether I should have handled things differently. Maybe I could have pushed harder on day one. Maybe I could have filed the complaint sooner. Maybe I could have given them one final warning. I don't know. What I know is this. Respect is usually cheaper than consequences. And that lesson ended up costing somebody a whole lot of money. So now I'm curious what you think. If a company repeatedly used your property without permission because it was more convenient for them, would you have done exactly what I did? Or would you have let it go for the sake of keeping the peace? Let me know down in the comments. Because I've heard strong arguments from both sides, and honestly, I'm interested to see where you stand.